Ladies and gentlemen,
I think your mic is off.
Ladies and gentlemen, yeah, I know, it's hard. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, do you hear me well? No? All right. I turned on 2 mics, so...
It's functioning. They can use it.
Okay.
If they don't hear.
If you don't hear, you can use your headphones.
This one. I have no idea it works.
Yeah, can I hear myself? Yeah.
I think the mic is on. Yeah, the mic is on.
Maybe the sound department could have a look at this.
Yeah, it's also for the translation. Oh, but they can hear it. They can use the hand.
Okay.
If they use it.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the European Parliament. Your Royal Highness, this is your first visit to this Parliament of Europe, and it is a true honor to host you today with my dear colleague Tomasz Stakowski. Your presence among us is truly significant, and that's why we are also live streaming this event. When we met in Washington, D.C. a few months ago, we discussed how the West, and particularly the EU, can and must help the people of Iran who are rising up against the Islamic regime. As part of that effort, I'm very humbled to have you among us today as part of this event on a secular, democratic Iran, implications for Europe's economy and security. Just last week, the European Council imposed further restrictive measures, sanctions, against Iranian officials and entities responsible for serious human rights violations in Iran. In response, the Islamic Republic blacklisted more MEPs, national MPs, and ministers to their list of sanctioned individuals. However, as the EU's position vis-à-vis the Islamic Republic is finally hardening in some respects, the EU's External Action Service continues its failed policy of seeking engagement with the Islamic Republic's regime, such as by pushing the nuclear talks agenda, JCPOA, or helping European companies through Instex bypass US sanctions on the Iranian regime. It is therefore so vital to include the voice of the Iranian diaspora and the Iranian opposition in any policy making concerning the Islamic Republic. We must stand side by side in support of democracy and human rights in Iran, as you have championed for so many years. Your Royal Highness, it's an absolute honor to have you among us today. Before introducing you further for your much anticipated speech, I would like to hand over the floor to my co-host, MEP Tomasz Stakowski, to share his welcoming remarks. Thomas, you've got the floor.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Thank you very much, distinguished guests, dear Crown Prince of Iran, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great honor and privilege to welcome you on the conference, A Secular Democratic Iran, Implication for Europe's economy and security. As the title indicates, we are here today to discuss the democratic future of Iran. In light of current pro-democracy protests in Iran, the question of democracy in Iran becomes highly actual. I'm optimistic. So I believe that the end of theocratic regime is near, and millions of people can hope for a better life and free life. Therefore, I would like to send a clear message to all Iranians by saying that we, the members of European Parliament, fully support the fight for democracy and freedom. I am coming from the Czech Republic, and I am able to understand very well your desire for freedom. Unfortunately, very often it is a tough fight, brings many sacrifices. For decades, a huge number of Czech men and women were fighting for obtaining our democracy. One of them, Václav Havel, the first president of the Czech Republic, finally became the freedom in our country. And the great men and inspiring politicians drew this aspiration toward democracy through these words. I dream about an independent, free, democratic republic. About a republic that is economically prosperous and at the same time socially just. In short, about a human republic that serves men and therefore has the hope that men will also serve it. I strongly believe Czechs and Iranians are sharing the same vision of the democratic republic. And I am glad to welcome today Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi in the European Parliament, in the House of Democracy. And I am looking forward to discuss on democracy and human rights in light of the current political situation in Iran. The Crown Prince, please welcome here in Brussels.
Thank you so much.
I will just say a few more words and then... Thank you, Thomas. It's always a pleasure to cooperate together. Your Royal Highness, as we discussed in Washington, D.C., the international community and the EU in particular must do much more to ensure democracy and human rights in Iran. Engagement with the Islamic Republic does not work. While the West has naively sought to close a nuclear deal, the mullahs have continued to escalate the nuclear file through increased nuclear enrichment. They have strangled dissent on the streets, arrested women for throwing off the hijab, executed protesters, and now we hear that they even poison schoolgirls. There is no end to what this regime is capable of doing. Their hands are covered with the blood of innocents in an effort to crush resistance. The EU must decide on which side to stand at this point in history, on the right side of history or on the wrong side of history. Either with the Iranian people calling for freedom and democracy, or with the authoritarian, theocratic regime that is the Islamic Republic. This is why I'm so honored to have you with us today, proud and loud voice for democracy, human rights, and for the Iranian people to determine its own future. As you said during the recent Munich Security Conference and many times in the past, external pressure must be kept on the regime in order to weaken it. Therefore, the EU sanction packages against regime officials and entities are to be welcomed, but it's not enough. And as you say, what we need is maximum pressure as well as maximum support. Instead of the EU's continued false policy of engagement, we need to opt for isolation of this regime. The EU needs to be unequivocal in its support for the Iran protests for human rights and democracy. Last October, the European Parliament joined your call for European tech companies to offer internet and VPN to support those protesting inside Iran. In January of this year, we also called for the introduction of further sanctions on regime officials and to proscribe the IRGC. If you ask me, we should also include Ayatollah Khamenei, because sanctions are nothing if they do not include those at the very top. And by the way, shouldn't the free world declare Khamenei and Raisi guilty of mufsede fil ard, corruption on earth. What do you think? I've also called on the EU member states to recall their ambassadors from Iran and expel the Islamic regime's diplomats from Europe. Only by standing firm on these points will the EU be able to truly stand side by side with the Iranian people in support of democracy. Your Royal Highness, Iran used to, prior to the Islamic Revolution, have friendly relations with Europe, with its neighborhood. Today, the Islamic Republic has been sponsoring terrorism throughout the region and the world. Here in Europe, many Iranian dissidents have been killed, and terror plots have been foiled. Iranians have been taken to the streets in opposition to the brutal regime. We, as the international community, must support them. We must support you, the Iranian opposition, to bring peace, prosperity, and democracy back to Iran. A free, secular, and democratic Iran would serve as a light among the nations again, as it has done for thousands of years. May Europe and European politicians be listening to your speech and join your movement to free Iran of its oppressive and brutal regime. Indeed, it is my expressed hope that the leaders of the EU institutions follow our initiative here today and that they meet with the democratic opposition. Your Royal Highness, welcome to the European Parliament once more, and I look forward to your long-anticipated speech. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Esteemed members of the European Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'd like to also acknowledge many Iranians who came from different cities in support of this event outside, so a little shout out to them. Mr. Weimer, Mr. Zdechowski, thank you and your party for your kind invitation. It is a pleasure for me to be here with you and your colleagues today. But more than that, it is an honor for me to speak to you on behalf of my compatriots who have tasked me with bringing their voice and their message to the elected representatives of the nations that make up the European Union. We are happy to see that after many years of focus on engagement with the current regime, international political discourse regarding Iran is turning towards of those who represent a democratic alternative on behalf of the true sovereigns of Iran, the Iranian people. And just as the various forces of the Iranian people's movement for freedom and democracy have united in unprecedented fashion, we appreciate that you too, as leaders of Western democracies, are growing more united despite partisan differences, in engaging and elevating the Iranian people. This is good news for my compatriots, but it is also for the better of Europe and the wider Western world, because the movement for freedom and democracy in Iran carries the promise of a brighter, safer, and more prosperous future for all democratic nations. Before I speak of the future, however, let us briefly consider the recent past. The criminal nature of the Islamic Republic that currently occupies my country should be clear and familiar to you in Europe. Due to its proximity to Iran and its significant energy needs, Europe has faced historically a tremendous burden of security risk and cost emanating from the nefarious designs and destructive behaviors of the Islamic Republic. Indeed, Islamic Revolution of 1979 was never intended by its authors to remain confined to Iran's borders. Many of the regime's leaders, Khomeini chief among them, did not historically and do not to this day see Iran as a nation, but as a vessel exploited for the development and export of their revolution. Only months after coming to power, the regime began its assault on Europe with the killing of my cousin, Captain Shahryar Shafiq, who was gunned down in the streets of Paris in 1979. From there ensued a campaign of terror whereby the Islamic Republic killed and maimed Iranian military leaders, intellectuals, artists and activists, including some of our most brilliant dissidents, right here on European soil. The regime's attempt at intimidation, kidnapping, and assassination have not ceased, and its targets have not been limited to Iranians. Indeed, there is in the case of Salman Rushdie, who suffered a brutal attack just last year, decades after the issuance of a bounty by Khomeini. And as we speak, the regime is targeting London's Jewish community, the cartoonists and staff of Charlie Hebdo, and the free press across Europe. Beyond that, it continues its long practice of taking European citizens among those from other parts of the Western world hostage and holding them for ransom. But perhaps no example better illustrates the danger of the Islamic Republic to Europe and its people than the regime's recent collaboration with Russia in its war of aggression in Ukraine. In the first war on the European continent after almost 80 years, the Islamic Republic is the only government outside Europe to be actively aiding and abetting Russia's invasion through the provision of military equipment. Yet, despite all of this terror and destruction by the Islamic regime, those who speak out against appeasement of the regime and advocate instead for support of the Iranian people's movement for human rights and democracy have long been maligned as supporters of foreign regime change wars. Know that I, as a soldier, as a patriot, and as a nationalist, would never support a foreign war against my country. But know also that this regime is waging war against Europe, against its land, people, and culture, just as it has waged war against my country since its inception. And that is why it is of utmost importance that the European Union confronts this regime and hold it accountable for its criminal behavior. As an immediate step, I call upon the European Union to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization. This designation would limit meaningfully the regime's ability to oppress the Iranian people and terrorize yours. It will also facilitate and accelerate defections from the regime by incentivizing those members of the armed forces in Iran whose hearts are with the Iranian people to join the people and support the peaceful transition to a secular democracy in Iran, for which I have always advocated. But for now, the Islamic Republic's war continues today. From Iranian women, the very first victims of this regime, to religious minorities, to workers, to dissidents, to artists, to the LGBTQ community, to our environment, this anti-Iranian regime has waged war on our country's land, people, history, and culture. Among the many of the targets of that war, the ecosystem of Iran has suffered tremendously from this regime's incompetence and malfeasance. Through unbridled deforestation, desertification, soil erosion, caused directly by this regime's actions and inaction, Iran is now confronted with an environmental crisis, with dried up lakes and wetlands, depleted aquifers, dust storms, loss of biodiversity, unmanaged landfills, and industrial wastewater, all of which further devastating the country and have the potential to extend well beyond its borders. The displacement and disruption of these developments will cause, both socially and economically, may produce a new wave of refugees in the direction of Europe. If the matter is not addressed urgently, thoughtfully and comprehensively, it will not be possible to resolve the problem until there is a wholesale political change in Iran. But there is hope, because there is a proud nation that is fighting back against this regime and its onslaught against our country and the world beyond it. Iranians are in the throes of a revolutionary movement that seeks to reclaim their country from the Islamic Republic, which they view as illegitimate occupying force. My compatriots in every corner of our nation are rising up courageously, united in their love for their country and commitment to free it from the Islamic Republic and revive and rebuild it. Some have characterized this movement as a struggle by Iranians to achieve Western civil and political rights. I do not share that view, and I caution those who would seek to interpret developments in Iran through an exclusively Western lens. Iran and European countries, and the Iranian people and European people, have much to share in terms of common history and contributions to human civilization. But Iran is an ancient country with its own rich cultural and political heritage and history, as a unified nation that traces back to more than 2,500 years, when Cyrus the Great issued what is now recognized in the West as the world's first proclamation of human rights. By the way, a few days ago, when I was in London, I had a chance to visit the British Museum, and of course you may know that Cyrus's cylinder is displayed there. It gives me a great sense of pride. This heritage and associated values of equality, justice and tolerance have been the focus of the Islamic Republic's war against Iran during the past 44 years. And it is precisely because of this heritage and these values that the Islamic Republic does not represent Iran and will not succeed in continuing to oppress the Iranian people. Indeed, my compatriots are not just seeking the world values, they are also fighting to reclaim and reinstitute their own. Just as in Europe, where the Dark Ages gave way to the brilliant period of Renaissance, the long night of the Iranian nation will soon give way to the rebirth and revival of Iran, enshrining a new era of friendship, peace and prosperity, both domestically and in Iran's relations with our neighbors and the free world. The message my compatriots offer you today, the alternative political reality that they stand to create with a secular democratic Iran, is very different from the prevailing political reality and the myriad security and economic threats it poses to you today. A secular democratic Iran would act not in the acute ideological interests of a corrupt radical few, but in the national interest of a nation of 85 million people who, unlike the current regime, are natural allies for Europe and the West. To those worried about the so-called vacuum after the inevitable fall of this criminal regime, I say with certainty and with pride that the Iranian people have the talent and the will, the technical experts, the political forces, and the national unity to manage the transition from this regime to a secular democracy. My compatriots at home are more than capable of administrating the affairs of our country during the transition period. My life's mission has been focused on aiding the Iranian people along this path. For decades, I have advocated the establishment of a secular democracy in Iran. I have said that the path towards this goal begins with acknowledgement of two fundamental truths: that the Islamic Republic poses an existential threat to Iran and its people, and that the Islamic Republic cannot be reformed. This path proceeds to there with civil disobedience, public demonstrations, and national strikes towards systemic collapse. This is the stage of events in Iran today. Following the end of the regime, this path must continue with free and fair elections for a constitutional assembly. And ultimately, this path must arrive at a national referendum in which each Iranian may cast a single equal vote toward the establishment of a secular democracy designed to safeguard each citizen's human rights. This is a point of agreement for the mainstream secular democratic opposition to the Islamic Republic. Political change in Iran and the emergence of a secular democracy would put an immediate end to the decade-long ongoing campaign of assassination, terror, and war. It would also offer immense and lasting economic opportunities to European companies and economies. As opposed to this regime being a threat to Europe's energy needs, a secular democratic Iran could oppositely satisfy such needs through mutual beneficial trade. And as opposed to the scant and fleeting economic benefits offered by to your companies by the defunct JCPOA, the opportunity for investment in the Iranian economy and partnership with Iranian businesses in a free Iran is incalculable. Iran today represents perhaps the world's largest remaining frontier market. From tourism along the Riviera of the Persian Gulf, to skiing in the mountains above Tehran, to development of the service industry in Kurdistan, to the production of solar plants in Khuzestan, to the creation of heavy industry in Sistan and Baluchistan, to wineries outside Shiraz, our nation, freed from the shackles of this regime, is yearning for international investment and economic growth that will have the added benefit of not only improving the livelihoods of my compatriots, but also helping to ensure political stability. The opportunities for our nations and businesses could not be greater. We are already beginning to think about the redevelopment and prosperity of our nation because that future, ladies and gentlemen, is at hand. What I have come to ask you for today is not just maximum pressure on the Islamic Republic, but also maximum support for our people. I ask you this not just because it is in the interest of my nation, but because it is in your interests as well. I have always told my compatriots that in our movement for national salvation, we must rely on no one other than ourselves. No foreign power can or should save us. Although my compatriots can and must carry the ultimate responsibility of achieving the victory of their movement, European support can significantly reduce the time and the cost of their brave struggle. During this trying time for the Iranian nation, when the people of my country are making every sacrifice for a future Iran that is free and democratic, it is my hope to be able to say to them that they are not alone, that today Europe stands with them, not their oppressors. And today and going forward, Europe recognizes the Iranian people, not the Islamic Republic, as the true sovereigns of Iran. May light triumph over darkness. Thank you.
Who's the question first?
What do you want?
Yeah, please.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And now we have some question, and I think that it will be quite interesting to hear to your remarks to our question what we prepare for you. And first, my question is, how do you see the future of Iran? Do you think that recent pro-democratic protests have chance to change the current regime? And second things, how is it looking the cooperation with another pro-democratic opposition outside Iran? Also, did you discuss what will happen if the regime has its problems or falling down? Also, it will be great to hear your remarks.
Well, as Iranians have witnessed in the last 5 months, a new era which is truly revolutionary. So we are beyond protests at this stage. It's really trying to hold the fort until the cavalry arrives. They are doing their part. The part that is missing, which is part of my main argument during this European tour, starting at the Munich Security Conference, discussions I have had with legislators in France, in England, and of course here in Belgium and at the level of the European Parliament, is precisely the component that is missing in terms of overall disposition of how to have a campaign of maximum support and not limited to just maximum pressure. In that element, of course, what incentivizes the nation and keeps the momentum going is the added fuel that is necessary to keep this movement along and running. The quickest way to cripple the regime is the ultimate means that we need to sustain labor strikes, which is the quickest way to paralyze the regime at a much lower cost of conflict with the current regime. But as we all realize, the practical issues have been, how do you fund such campaigns? Under the current restrictions, under the sanctions, it is very difficult to be able to send money back home. Many of you, I'm sure, are trying to do this, but you know how complicated it is. And yet, without having huge sums to be transferred, it makes a significant impact on our compatriots' livelihood, their ability to sustain themselves, not to worry about putting bread on the table at the end of the day, so they can more and more actively continue the resistance against the regime. We need to work together with governments that can help us bypass some of the current restrictions under sanctions, so at least while the bad guys don't get the money, the good guys could receive it. So everything that goes in the direction of facilitating those kind of financial transactions will go a long way in aiding and facilitating and empowering the resistance even more. We had been discussing before whether or not any confiscated or frozen assets that is the Iranian people's money in the first place could be repurposed to fund strike funds, for instance. I don't know what the legal ramification or the procedure may be, but that's a potential source. I also believe that at some point in time, in solidarity with the Iranian labor forces, it would be good to talk to international labor unions to stand in solidarity with their fellow kind in Iran as a gesture of support and solidarity. And that would be another added element that goes even beyond what governments can do. The potential is there, and I believe the mindset that my compatriots have had all along is why is it that until now the discourse was limited just to the regime and its representative. Now that they see that their voices are being heard, now that they see that those of us that can speak on their behalf to the international community can now be in session and conversation with legislators in Europe as well as the government side of it. Because I believe we have come to the point that nobody any longer questions the why, but rather want to understand the how we can bring change to Iran. It is imperative that we have these kind of conversations and opportunities, because through that we can come up with a solution, the formulas and the actual implementation of programs that will help in this stage the campaign to push the regime over the brink, but immediately after, how do we manage the transition and the components associated with that?
Thank you. I have a question building on what you said regarding the vacuum after the fall of the Islamic Republic. Now, I do believe that the sympathies among European leaders lie with the protesters. But despite that, we see a hesitation in pushing for maximum pressure against the regime. We see it in the hesitation to prescribe the IRGC. We see it in the will to keep the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, linger in limbo. And I would argue that three reasons may form sort of the basis for that action. Number one, business interests. Many are afraid that challenging the Islamic Republic head-on would mean a final stop for any business activities of big companies of European countries in Iran. Number two, the fear of nuclear enrichment getting out of control if JCPOA is put to the dustbins of history. Number three, the Islamic Republic is the devil they know. We have seen the aftermath of Iraq, Syria, Libya. What do we say to those who fear the overthrow of the Islamic Republic, including their fear for an insurgency or even a fully fledged civil war? So, yeah, that would be my question.
To take your last point as the first answer, I would say one thing that is ominously present in the psyche of every Iranian. The day Khomeini stepped back to Tehran for the first time after 15 years, and he was asked by a reporter, "What is your feeling after 15 years of exile?" And you know what his answer was? No. Nothing. Janam Fadai Iran is the answer of today's nation. They care about their own country. How could you possibly consider that the devil that you don't? It can't be evil. It could only be truth. If you trust in the Iranian people who are sacrificing their lives in the interest of their own country and not a regime that couldn't care less about the Iranian people, there lies the difference. Whom do you choose to trust more? Whom do you choose to trust more? Now, yes, we understand. Trust them. Trust them. We shall fight, we shall die, but we'll take our country back, is the slogan.
Amen.
So if there is any devil, know these devils. These are the other devils you ought to know.
That they don't know, but are about to get to know. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And that's through dialogue. How could you possibly get an answer to the solution by talking to the people who are part of the problem? That has been our argument from day one. And thank you for providing us finally, after 40 years, the opportunity to hear the different voice, not that the one that represents the regime and its interests, but that of a nation that have the exact same values that we commonly cherish and simply want to implement in our own country. And that's where it starts. That's where you give a chance for a nation to find its way back on track of modernity and progress and rejoin the progressing, civilized, advanced world that benefit from all the values embedded in democracy and human rights and secularism as a precondition to democracy. We have paid the price of living 43 years under religious dictatorship to appreciate and comprehend the importance of separation of church from state as a prerequisite to democracy.
Thank you very much, Your Royal Highness, for those remarks. Yes, and I do believe you made a very important point that it's within the Iranian culture that this spirit exists. The Iranian nation has been fighting for its freedom for a long time, now 43 years. But the sense of freedom was there all along. It did not come from here. It came from within. I think that when it comes to future policies of the EU, there has been a lack of imagination. I was mentioning business. I used to say to my colleagues that, okay, well, we're doing business, or you're doing business with this Islamic Republic right now, dysfunctional Islamist kleptocracy. Can you imagine what business it would be with a free, secular, and democratic Iran with a market economy? Could you imagine the business opportunities there? So we need to convince, I think, European lawmakers, leaders, that the future is much brighter than the present with a free Iran. So that's the point I tried to make.
And there's another element to this, because don't forget that the money doesn't go to the pockets of the Iranian people. You're doing business with IRGC and the corrupt mafia ruling our country.
Yes.
The people of Iran don't benefit from that arrangement.
That's the Islamist kleptocracy. Yeah, indeed. So one esteemed colleague from the EPP group, Slovakia, Miriam Lexman, is here, and I would like to acknowledge your presence and give you the opportunity to take the floor, Miriam.
Thank you very much. Honorary Prince, welcome to the European Parliament.
Thank you
and
so much.
I, as a person coming from ex-communist country, of course, I follow very closely the developments in Iran, because every totalitarian regime is something which we need to see how to help the people in their fight for freedom. We were helped in '89 and before, and Tomáš is from then the same country, because it was then Czechoslovakia. But now we are representing two countries which have split in a peaceful way, and we have also relatively peacefully managed to transition from a communist totalitarian regime into democracy. And I have maybe two questions. You have already listed a couple of suggestions what we can do as Western governments, free governments or free societies, to support your fight for freedom. But is there anything we can do especially for the women in Iran? Because we do know that they were the front fighters, front runners in this last wave of expression of desire for freedom. So if there is anything we can do more, I mean, there were a couple of expressions of solidarities, but if you have anything in mind we can do extra, I will appreciate. And the second question, I have two questions. The second question is, what would you, because your messages were, in what way we can help, or what guarantees the people really sacrificing even their life and freedom, and physical freedom, for their mental freedom and desire of a free country do. And my question maybe is, what would be the messages the Western government should maybe understand from your fight for freedom? And I have particular one angle, but of course you can list whatever comes to your mind, but I have one angle, is that because you mentioned secular society, and sometimes I'm afraid that our free societies are becoming too secular, that we are pushing religion to the private homes because we are afraid how to manage the relationship. Is there anything you would maybe mention to us on this term? That is there any healthy balance, that secularism doesn't mean that the religion doesn't exist in a public life? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for actually pointing to two very interesting topics. Of course, the support for women. Well, again, the messaging is key. When the world stands with them, when this whole campaign that started with the tragic death of Mahsa Amini and the Women Life Freedom Movement started, and the whole world responded to it in an unprecedented unprecedented fashion, not just from the political sphere, from Hollywood to athletes to football clubs to you name it. It's been all over the place. And, you know, all of a sudden that brings another dimension that, well, this is such an overwhelming support, but how do you sustain it? How do you continue it? There have been tremendous amount of activities back home within civil society, advocates for human rights, for women's rights, and the more you can manage to engage Iran's civil society, and of course the regime will try to block it in every form that it can, but even if it is not in direct communication, but at least the messaging part, it can only reinforce that they are on the right track and you have their back, so to speak. But you could, in many cases, receive and invite those who can offer testimony or accounting and what they think could be measures to be taken to actually explain to you in what way it could be more impactful or more meaningful. All of this depends on engaging even on more dialogue, creating panels to discuss. I think that in terms of even in a political sense, I remember this from years ago when I had previous meeting with various parties in Europe, that even in the area of organization and political structuring of future political parties, they can put workshops, they can offer them ideas, and in that sense, you pretty much facilitate the mechanics of how quickly we can prepare the grounds for when we get into the normalization phase, how we can bring maximum empowerment to any exercise. At this point, as you know, because of this repressive nature, engaging directly is sometimes complicated, so we can find other means of communications. Fortunately, technology is around us and we can communicate. I, for myself, on a regular basis, speak directly by Zoom or by Google Meet or by even WhatsApp, having some FaceTime conversation with activists at home, political prisoners, you name it. It's not impossible to communicate and exchange information. And speaking of the internet, by the way, as you all know, one of the biggest asks right now is to make sure that connectivity and access to internet in Iran is preserved at any cost, because it is vital for information to flow both ways and, of course, for organization and purposes. While we're on the subject, I thought I would add that to the equation. All of this will help get more access, more information, and on that basis, formulating the appropriate approach or policies. We are trying to also work on a project-centric approach, whereby a variety of projects are focusing on what needs to be done. On the issue of transitional justice, as how do we deal with the process, on the issue of women's rights or LGBTQ rights or everything of that nature. All of these require some expertise, and I know there are many people within the diaspora who can volunteer to help and populate these projects. This is something else that you could also look at. It's not just a discourse with those of us in the political field of things in terms of the opposition, but also all the expertise needed to address many of these issues, to maximize, if you will, our potential of how we can assist. So that could perhaps be also built into the equation.
Thank you. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of two members of the Swedish Parliament here, Mr. Arin Karapet of the Moderate Party of Sweden and Mr. Rashid Farivar from the Sweden Democrats. Mr. Farivar has a question, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I prepare my question with a short message. So I'm really honored to be here. I would like to thank you, Your Honor, for visiting us in Europe and giving us the chance to meet you and discuss this important issue with you about Iran. And I would like to thank you, my colleague Charlie Weimers, and all other colleagues who are making this happen. So I have a message to the Parliament members in Europe and all other legislators in Europe. Stop being naive and stop indulging with the fascist Islamic regime, which has no remorse towards its own people. This shall stop. We say in Sweden, spade shall be called a spade, and IRGC shall be recognized as a terrorist organization because it is a terrorist organization. And this fascist regime has to go, and it will go. And I really appreciate, Your Honor, your plan and your vision for the future of Iran. This is really important, and I applaud you for having that vision on paper. And also I really applaud your vision of maximum inclusion and maximum defection. This is what will make the revolution in Iran successful. And also for legislators who are still a little naive about Iran and are thinking about their profit or the companies of profit. That profit is mixed with Iranian people's blood, innocent blood. And they should, and those companies dealing with Iran, with Islamic regime right now, they should understand that Iranian people will remember who were with them, but will never forget who were against them, who were not with them. That was my main message, and my question was that the problem in Iran, the people in Iran who are fighting, they are the people who are doing their real job on the streets. They are the people who are having their life in their hands on the street. How can we give them even more hope to continue this fight? I'm sorry that I'm not in Iran. My family, my parents, they are living in Iran. My sister, my brother, all my family. So how can we give them more hope? Thank you again.
Thank you. Well, I think that the most direct way of giving them more hope is to, in fact, explain to them more what you are able to do as a member of parliament outside and how you create and draw attention to their plight. Because as long as they know there's somebody out there caring and concerned and doing something about it, that's one way of giving them more hope that they're not alone out there. Incidentally, I forgot to address back to the previous question of how could we do more for women? I'm oddly surprised, and I'm sure many women in this room will agree with me, that the proportion of representation of women in the political sphere is very tilted in favoring the male than the female component. And perhaps one of the reasons that we could elevate the presence in the political sphere, which maybe for some reasons they might have shied away until now, doing mostly advocacy or human rights activities, but less of a presence in the political sphere, that's also one way to encourage women to be more emboldened to be participants in the political sphere as well. And as we have many male delegates now in European parliaments representing the Iranian, Swedish Iranian or Belgium Iranian or what have you, the proportion is still very tilted. So I would like to invite those already in the loop and Iranian women who need to be more present, in my opinion, in the political sphere to balance out, at least on more equal footing, your representation. That is also a very strong signal back home, because the fact that there are, in fact, proportionally perhaps more educated women in Iran, statistically, it would be a shame for them not to be at the fullest possible force represented. Maybe that's the kind of actions that people like yourselves could take to have a foot through the door, so to speak, and get more of our women engaged in the political sphere as well. That, I think, will be helpful. I hope you ladies agree with me.
Your Royal Highness, I have another question. Together with other prominent Iranian opposition figures in exile, you've been working on a common charter for transition. Khamenei's health and who would be his successor are often topics of speculation. What are your views on this, and could you elaborate a bit more on your ideas for transition? What do you view as the role of the international community, and particularly the European Union, in supporting you in this process and hopefully one day soon its implementation?
Well, everything starts with having agreed principles that we can all, under that agreement, begin cooperations and work collectively. And you alluded to this charter, which, by the way, has been highly inspired over years of activity of our activists at home as well as our political prisoners. We take inspiration in their demand and their ask to formulate what constitutes the basic areas of commonality, of agreement and interest, which is the basis of cooperation at this stage, that basically facilitates a coalition of democratic-minded Iranian secular opposition forces, of course diversified in ideology, but commonality of purpose and goal. That's an important thing for everyone to understand of how we are approaching the subject and encouraging the kind of cooperation and perhaps even creation of coalition among Iranian political groups and activists. And it has already begun to some extent. Everyone understands that this is a fairly new stage, but we are moving as fast as we can so we can sooner begin implementing this kind of activities in dialogue and, of course, preparing the stage. Other than that, what in terms of expansion, and to your point, sir, about maximum inclusion and maximum defections, the more sort of gravity surrounds this approach, the more we can have more forces joining. One element that has been absent in all these years was the political divide between the secular democratic forces that have always called an end to this regime and a large part of the Iranian society that has been were until now caught into the discourse of reform. And what is quite different today, and we're beginning to see more indications of that, is that there's a beginning of a convergence towards our position from those who have given up on any hope or belief that reform is even possible with this regime. It may have taken a lot of time for them, but the truth is that right now we're beginning to see that, which is more addition to the expansion of this coalition. And that's a positive development. I think we should take every advantage of that in terms of a policy of inclusion and invite everyone who is willing to participate to stand up and be counted and actually participate. They should not await an invitation. They should consider that this is a free bus. Remember my analogy in Georgetown? By that I meant anybody can step forward, and the only curriculum or condition to be a partner in this project is to agree on those fundamental issues declared in that charter. And as long as you believe in those principles, we can work together towards a common objective.
Thank you. I would like to give the floor to Mr. Arin Karapet of the Swedish Parliament.
Thank you, Charlie, Your Royal Highness, or as we say in Farsi, Shahzade. We have had several meetings today, and the message that is becoming more clear and clear, just not in the Iranian diaspora. In Sweden, we have more than 150,000 Iranians. As I said to Your Royal Highness, sometimes they count me because I have an Iranian passport, but sometimes they don't count me because I'm Armenian from Iran. But I consider me to be proud Swedish Armenian from Iran. So, and I will come to my question, but this is important, most for members of parliaments who are not with Iranian backgrounds. Iran has been for 1,000 years a multicultural country where Armenians for 700 years have been a part of the Iranian society, Jewish Iranians, Muslim Iranians, Baha'is, etc., etc. A multiculturalism that Europe have never had, just seen maybe the last 100 years because of big migration. And I want to see that Iran again, the multicultural Iran, where people who have faith or don't have a faith can coexist, It doesn't, no matter which sexuality you have, or if you're a man or a woman. The new generation Iranians are paying the debt because of my parents' mistakes generation. And the reason we can see that there is a real movement, because the time has come when we see young boys protecting their sisters, their classmates, 8, 9, 10 years old, and saying, enough is enough. Then you know the revolution is ongoing. There is no question if the revolution is dead. The revolution is ongoing. And and I will be quite short now. You are the game changer. And we, as members of parliament from different countries, we will do whatever we can to help you, your staff, the Iranian society, to see a free Iran, because I want to see my mother without a hijab standing outside the Armenian church, the same. And it should also be an Iran where whoever who wants to wear hijab can wear the hijab, but it shouldn't be forced. But my question is, when we will have a free democratic Iran, what kind of relation do you want to see between Europe and the new democratic free Iran? Thank you.
Well, I can only say, and I'm sure I'm not the only one thinking that, because if you think of the Iranian diaspora living in Europe, and let's not forget that the first exodus out of Iran landed them first on European soil. I remember the early 80s, where the initial community of Iranian refugees or people who had to flee and escape the country first came to European soil, predominantly in Germany, France, and England, and later on spread a little bit further to Scandinavian countries. Some ended up all the way to Canada and eventually the United States. But at the very beginning, the bulk of the diaspora found itself on European soil, not just because it was the first address they could find, but because they had a foothold there, they had relatives there, they had a cultural tie to it. Many had studied in those countries before. And as a result, the connectivity and the relationship existed even before the revolution. And since then, at least 2 generations of Iranians born and now naturalized citizens of European countries still have ties to Iran, still travel sometimes to Iran. As I was saying earlier at lunch, that, in the past, how much effort has to go to educate an Iranian to come back to Iran after studying abroad, how much diplomacy was necessary to connect with the outside world. Today we have de facto at least 5 million ambassadors outside of Iran, a third of that being in Europe proper. You're talking at least over 1.5 million people, if not 2 million people, who are the national connections to our country between Europe and Iran. And they are all over the place as administrators, as directors, as entrepreneurs, as businessmen, and even those in politics. I don't know how else to quantify it, but this is the greatest existing ties. The only thing that remains to be done is to remove the barrier of this regime out of the way so we can re-engage in that connectivity and jointly benefit from a cooperation, because we do have vital strategic common interests, not to mention common values. It's just a matter of time to immediately redress the situation. And in fact, I suppose that from the economic interest perspective and the potential of what a future Iran could represent for opportunities, for investment, for development, for companies, and the Iranians knowing full well how much technology and new investment, newer energies, or any other infrastructure that we need to develop There's a natural connections right there. There's immediately implementable projects. And of course, if part of the key industries that Iran can then rejuvenate so that the energy dependence that Europe has could find a solid partner for a long time that Iran could be, so you're not limited and have to hold your breath about Russian gas. That's where Iran ties in. Not to mention the migration problem, which could come to a stop and perhaps even be reversed, which is something that also is to be considered. All of that is as a result of that change, and we need to work in this phase and later on, and the opportunities are endless. So it's not even whether we should consider things, it's already there. It's just a matter of time for that obstacle to be removed, and I think it will automatically occur. Automatically occur. We don't even have to really plan for it. It will automatically occur. But we can still have at least a roadmap of where we can start, and that's exactly why such exchanges and dialogue will be beneficial. So at least it draws a little bit of a game plan, which is clearer on everybody's mind.
Thank you. Thomas?
I started my political career when I was 34, and as a young politician, the Iranian diplomat in Prague invited me to speak with me about Iranian opposition, and they told me, everybody are traitors. But if I feel the atmosphere here, I will tell you that you have it much more Iran in your heart than the diplomat in Prague. Also, I would like to say that I feel the emotion. And my grandfather was in concentration camp. When the Nazis came, they put him to the concentration camp because he was fighter for the democracy. He was soldier. He trusts to democracy and to principles that democracy is much more stronger than any dictatorship. And I would like to tell you that if you really trust to victory, the victory will trust to you. And I trust that you will have it the same picture as your mother before the Armenian church one times, because democracy is much more, and freedom is much more stronger than dictatorship and pressure of the regime. And my question to you is about nuclear weapons. Iranian regime every time promoted that they have power because they have nuclear weapons, and they withdraw the agreement about nuclear deal. What do you think about this nuclear deal? Do you think that it's important? Have it any fight with your neighbors and around in the region with everybody, or do you think that Iran, as a democratic country, can trust to the peaceful process with their neighbors?
So that's an excellent question. Of course, this is just my personal opinion. Don't consider this the policy of future governments, because they will have to decide the case. But my opinion has always been this. First and foremost, there's a saying that says it's not the gun but the finger on the trigger. It's the nature of this regime that cannot be trusted, regardless of what document they sign. But also it's the understanding of where I think Iran has a natural strategic depth and advantage in terms of our neighborhood in where we could be, and why should we lose that advantage by giving an equalizing element in the process of proliferation of nuclear weapons, which doesn't make any sense. I remember when Iran was at the time looking at nuclear energy to begin with as a substitute for burning fossil fuels. And we first looked at gas turbines. It was not that efficient, high pollution, and not that cost effective. Then we looked at solar energy. That also was a very technology in its infancy, not quite yet efficient. And we finally came to whether we should consider nuclear reactors as an alternate source of electricity production. And it's interesting that those in charge of the Iranian Atomic Agency went to my father and they asked him, you know, the Pakistanis are doing their thing in the neighborhood. Should we consider military application of it? And my father's logic was very clear. He said, suppose that we even were able to manufacture a few missiles. Are we going to stop over 3,600 Soviet missiles? Is that a deterrence? were we able to control the situation with the potential conflict that Iraq could have posed before the revolution, Iran at the time being the third strongest conventional army, and we were able to in fact do that? And why should we even think in that direction that we will feel more secure as citizens, that we have potentially so many other missiles pointed at us and sleep easier at night than not having it, thereby stopping proliferation? So Iran signed the non-proliferation treaty. As a result of that, we were partners in the consortium that was arranged with the French to supply Iran's two first reactors in Bushehr, who were supposed to come online in 1982, but all of a sudden everything changed, and since then we fell into a completely different direction. I personally think that we should bypass nuclear even for civilian purposes, simply because with the recent earthquake we witnessed in Turkey and Syria, Iran is on a seismic plate. It's not a safe place for such technology. A Chernobyl incident could occur at any time. And the Japanese, despite the highest standards of safety, barely escaped the disaster a few years ago. I question whether or not we can afford such high risk in the area in which we are, when we don't have access to water to begin with, or low populations where you could potentially even consider having a nuclear reactor. Yes, I know we spent too much money that we threw the Russian way, and we have yet to produce a kilowatt of nuclear energy. But then again, when I think of renewable energies, cleaner energies, solar, wind, and others, that's the direction I'd rather take, while satisfying the concern of our neighbors that under a different Iran, rather than spending on armament or these kind of things, we can have regional pact security and military pact, thereby reducing the budget that we would have to otherwise annually spend, and instead purpose that to education, to healthcare, to pension funds, and so on and so forth. It would be stupid of us to use our resources on militarizing versus each other, because the mindset is based on trust and mutual interest, as opposed to antagonism and protecting ourselves from it. That's the mindset that the regime has set in the region. We are going to reverse that as fast as possible, because we need to repurpose our resources on issues that are far more serious for us domestically and in cooperation with our neighbors. That's my mindset, but that's just my opinion. The decision has to be made by future people in charge of making policy, but that will be heavily my recommendation to such decision makers in our future.
Your Royal Highness, thank you so much for your time today. It has been truly enlightening to take part of your thoughts, and this may have been your first visit to the European Parliament, but I do hope it's not the last. And our door always remains open for the voice of moderation, human rights, and secular democracy. Mark my words. And hopefully, not too far from now, also other institutions here in Brussels, the European Commission, European Council, will open its doors for the voices of the Iranian people. We'd like to thank everyone here, ladies and gentlemen, for coming and joining us today, as well as those who have been watching online, quite a few, I've heard. I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Tomasz Stakowski, for some final words and to close today's meeting. Thank you very much, and long live the Iranian people.
I think that you said everything what is most important from this event, and I'm looking forward. Please, if you want something change, speak about the vision. We are not talking about current regime. We are speaking about regime and future for Iran. And it's most important things. If you want something to change, change it. And everybody has it. Democracy of your country in your hand. Everybody can tweet it, everybody can retweet it, everybody can write something positive about people who are fighting for the democracy, about you, about your visit, and about everything what we were discussing today. Also, if you want something to change, you have it, your power. And take it to your hands and show up the regime that you don't have it fear. Thank you very much and have a nice evening.
I guess it's to the press conference.
شاهزاده